Life is busy, full of all the things, and it's easy to put faith on the back burner. Faith Informing is here to make space. Space to wonder together about what informs our faith and how that faith in turn forms us into faithful followers of Jesus Christ. This show is for you. A pause in the noise. Permission to contemplate the deep matters of faith, not in a hurry, but in hope. I'm Travis Jameson. I'm a pastor, an author, and your host for the Faith Informing Podcast. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Abram Van Engen. He is a professor in the humanities and the chair of the English department at the Washington University in St. Louis. And he's joined me on the show today to talk about his latest book, Word Made Fresh, an invitation to poetry for the church. Abram, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have this conversation and talk to you about all things poetry.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Well, by way of introducing yourself, do you want to share a bit about what led you to fall in love with poetry? Because I assume you've got to be in love with poetry to both have a podcast on poetry and write a book on poetry.
Yes, it's true. I do indeed like poetry. And I'll tell a little bit of my story, but I don't want it to be, I don't want it to dissuade others from falling in love with poetry, because I liked poetry from an early age, and many people don't, and that's okay too. There's still a lot to love, even when you find it in your adulthood. But I liked it from an early age, and I think one of the things I liked about it, well, I just love words. I think words are kind of magical. I love the way that words can do so many different things at the same time. They can work in so many different ways. I love the kind of richness of looking back over hundreds of years of tradition and finding these words that still have the same power to move us that they had back then. So from an early age, I loved words. And I remember being in junior high trying to put together a kind of poetry book. We had a poetry assignment, so everybody had to write poetry. And I kind of just wrote a whole lot of poetry. I'm sure it was very, very bad. But it was my first attempt to kind of see what this art form is about and what it's for and what it can do. And I'm not technically a scholar of poetry. I just like to teach it and read it. And so I've been sort of just studying words all my life. I kind of knew I wanted to be in a profession where words were at the heart of it.
That's amazing. I love that it began way back when you were a kid. My daughter, just this year, she's been in fourth grade, and it's kind of the poetry year where in class they're learning a lot about poetry. And it's amazing for kids, for a lot of kids, what I've noticed is that they don't have the same kind of strong reaction to poetry as adults do. A lot of adults have this really strong kind of sometimes negative connotation around poetry that it's hard to read, hard to understand. But I've seen so many kids, they just have this attraction to it. And it's definitely been true for my daughter. She's just, it's like never crossed her mind that she wouldn't be able to write a poem. Ever since she learned, she's like, of course I can do this. And it's so fun to watch. So that's great that it.
Well, I'd say real quick, just two words on that I like to share. I mean, so one is that most kids like poetry. I mean, this is not unusual. And if you look at the children's books, almost all of them are written in some kind of poetic form. They usually have rhythm and meter and rhyme, even if they're about like dinosaurs and underpants or something. They're usually written like in poetry. And one of the questions is, well, why is it that so many children's books try to write poetry, even bad poetry, to sell books? And it's because I think children have a kind of natural inclination to like it. And they have to learn to dislike it later. But they start off loving it. I mean, it's rhythm, it's music, it's rhyme, it's all the things we find pleasurable about language from an early age. And so I think it only comes later that people begin to say, well, poetry is weird or too hard or too difficult or it's not for me or I don't get it.
Hmm.
And so the second thing I would say about that is that poetry was the main language of the masses for forever. I mean, since
Mm.
from oral cultures on down into really it was only in the 19th century, basically late 18th, 19th century, that the novel replaced poetry as the main sort of genre of the masses. So most people, most of the time, turned to poetry, and it was really for the people for most of human history.
And now, is that because of like a factor of people not being literate, or like
I
why
think that's
was
part of it
poetry held
because
sway?
one thing about poetry is that most of it is mnemonic. That is, it's useful for memory. It's helpful for memory. It's
Hmm.
most of its devices are meant to help you with remembering and memorizing the lines. So I think that's part of it. Part of it is, a lot of poetry is short. It's easily transferable. You can keep it with you, and that's still the case today with a lot of poetry. So it's really good for an oral culture for sure. But even beyond an oral culture, the literate folks would write poems to each other. They never expected to publish them. They never expected them to be high art. They never expected to do anything with them. But it was a way of it was a social art. You would write poems to your dad. You would write poems to your daughter. And they would just circulate that way. So there was a lot more poetry going on
Yeah.
as the kind of social art of the people for many, many years.
I can imagine that, like people, writing a poem to their wife or their a
Yeah,
relative, someone they love. And I've done that before, even in my own family. And there's a less pressure, at least in my mind, in my experience, when you're writing a poem just for one person to read. You're like,
yeah,
this isn't for
right,
anyone else. This is just for them, and they know it's from me. So regardless of how quote unquote good or bad it is,
right,
they'll appreciate it in a special way.
exactly. Yeah.
And I wonder, like, is the opposite true in history? Did people write poetry as a way of antagonizing others, or out of spite or something? Was there that kind of poetry at
I
all?
mean, there could be. Yeah. I mean, for sure, you could kind of take jabs at people that way. And,
Uh-huh.
um, I'm trying to think through whether there was amateur versions. There's definitely professional versions of that where people are taking
Mhm.
jabs at people professionally through poetry. But I don't know so much about the amateur side seems to flow mostly out of like love, social networking, just
Mhm.
sort of a desire to commune with others and share with others. And very often it would just be part of the art of, I mean, part of it was schooling. If you were literate, schooling passed through poetry. So everybody had the art at some level to their fingertips to be able to write a poem and pass it to somebody.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things about and doing the podcast that I do called Poetry for All, we did a couple of eighth century Chinese poems in translation. And what I learned in doing that, we had a guest on to teach us some of this stuff, is that in that culture and really through much of Chinese history, poetry was an essential part of the culture. So it was part of your resume. So in order to get a government job, you had to write poems
Hmm.
as part of the basic culture of the period. So I mean, that's a really different,
Can you imagine?
fascinating aspect.
Can you imagine that today?
Yeah,
I mean, you hear about these high school students and they're like doing extra math classes and all kinds of things to
right.
prepare for their college applications. What if we made it so they had to take extra poetry classes as
Right. Or to
well?
be defense secretary, you had to write a really good poem.
Yeah, that would probably do some good for our world. I think that's for certain. Um, yeah, that is just phenomenal. I also think about, you know, people using poems for a way of social networking. My mind immediately went to a challenge that our listeners can take from this today is try sending your next text message in poem form and see if you can
Mm,
connect with whoever you're
hmm
trying to connect with.
hmm
That would be kind of a fun experiment to see how that
Well,
goes.
and I really think reclaiming the ground between professional poet and I don't do any poetry at all.
Mm.
There's a vast middle ground of like, I don't expect to publish this. And yet it conveys something to somebody that I love that no other art form can do, and which the recipient receives it, knows that I wrote a poem for them, and feels differently about it because it's a poem than if it were even a letter.
Mhm.
Like there's a huge middle ground of just amateur poetry that is worth pursuing and loving and sharing. And I think a lot of that's been lost because people are like, "Yeah, well, there's professional poets and there's me. I don't do poetry, and so you either do it or you don't."
Yeah, those are the only two options in most
Yeah,
people's mind. Yes, absolutely. And I think, the amateur poet, I actually find when I read amateur poetry, sometimes it resonates more deeply with me
yeah,
because it's not trying to be something like
right,
professional.
right.
It doesn't have all the tools of the craft, so to speak, that maybe a professional has at their able to use right off the bat. But an amateur poet it just seems to like, oh, this is my language. This makes
Hmm.
sense. It
Yeah.
resonates. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, an amateur, that word we tend to associate with being mediocre, but actually the word comes from love, to love something.
Hmm.
So it's the old Latin root amo, So an amateur is someone who loves doing something. That's it. So you could be an amateur cello player, which means you just love playing the cello and you're not doing it for professional paid reasons. You're just doing it because you love it. And the same with poetry. You could have amateur poets who just like reading and writing poetry and have no desire to be a professional poet or paid for it or recognized for it. It's just a part of your life because you love it.
That really strikes me as something that can really breathe a lot of fresh air into people's lives if they recovered that.
Yeah.
Like in the sense, like we're so drowned out, I feel like, by this need to get ahead in life and to make money off of whatever we do to commodify it in some way. And to be able to better appreciate the things we love as that is good enough. Like you can just love a thing and do it.
Yeah.
And that's enough
Totally.
for you. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah. I love that. I feel like we could talk about that for a long time because
Yeah.
I just feel like so many areas of life people give up on or don't pursue because they don't see how it can, benefit them in their career or
Yeah.
something like that. Um, well, that's great. And I think that kind of drives into um, how you become the kind of person who might like poetry. But
Yeah.
before we get to that, can you just say a little bit about, your thoughts on what what do you think happens for a lot of people? They start off as a kid, they're reading all these stories
Yeah.
that are all in poetic forms, and they love
Hmm.
them. And then when they're 22 or 42, all of a sudden, like those kinds of forms seem distant. They don't connect as well. What do you think is
Yeah.
going on there?
Well, so I do think that part of it is that the great poets of the 20th century, many of them became great by this movement to make things difficult. Like they were intentionally trying to make things difficult. And that was part of the next great movement of poetry as they perceived it. And they succeeded. They made it difficult. Now, now I do think, if you're in the world of poetry and you really study it, they did amazing things, wonderful things, incredible things. If you're kind of on the edges of poetry, you look at some of the things that they did and you think, what are they doing? Like, I don't get it. Who is this for? This isn't for me. And part of what happened, I think, is that also those particularly difficult poems became canonized and taught in schools, and schooling has a huge
Yeah.
effect on how we perceive things, right? So there's a ton of 20th century poetry that is not difficult, that is professionally not difficult, that is awesome. If you think that like, oh, no poets write in rhyme anymore, that's not true. Like there's tons of poets who write in lots of formal verses and formal, villanelles and sonnets and all the rest. They still write in those forms. They still love those forms. They still use those forms. But we just kind of have this perception that no, everything's free verse now, and it's weird associations, and I don't get it.
Hmm.
And I think so. That I think that poetry kind of did this to itself, and to some extent, but also the way of canonization and schooling did some of this. So what I like to say to people is, whether you start in the 20th century, 19th, 18th, wherever you want to start, if you start reading poetry of any period and read broadly, you will find poems that you love. I can guarantee
Hmm.
this. Like they are out there waiting to be found. They will move you, they will resonate with you, and you will just find yourself sort of taken aback by what you're reading. It's just that I think people have too narrow a conception of what poetry is and too narrow a reading, and they say, well, I don't like that. I don't like, say, T.S. Eliot, and therefore I don't like poetry.
Hmm. Yeah, you really emphasize that in the beginning part of your book. I mean, it just this sense that um, if you don't like a poem, just move on and then find
Yeah,
another poem. That like
yeah,
it's no big deal. You don't need to worry about it. Like just keep
yeah,
going and reading more poetry, and you will find poems you like. Just like it's like you don't like every book you read, but you find books you read that
yeah.
find books that you like.
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one rule for entering into poetry, if you haven't read poetry in a while and you think that it's not for you, the number one rule is to allow yourself to dislike it. Like,
Mm,
just allow yourself to say, ah, it doesn't work for me.
hmm
Because if as soon as you allow yourself to say that, what you're doing is you're saying, I'm not going to let somebody else be the judge of what works for me or not. So and
hmm
so said this is a masterpiece. Well, guess what? It doesn't work for me. Well, guess what? You're an adult and you're allowed to say that. So set it down, find another thing, and start reading. If you allow yourself to dislike poetry and you move through a bunch of it, you will find poetry that you really, really, really like. And it's just a matter of allowing yourself the chance to move pretty quickly through a lot of different kinds of things until you hit on the stuff that you like.
Yeah. And it is fascinating with poetry how it's like we get confronted by a poem and then it almost feels like it paralyzes us. Like, oh,
Hmm.
and especially when someone else has said this is a good poem, then
Right.
you're like, wow, either they're wrong or there's something wrong with me. Like
Right.
it's not resonating. And so,
Right.
yeah, like recently I was reading a book and the author was talking about these different poets that influenced him. And I thought, oh, that's I'm gonna pick up some of their poetry and read some of it. The way he
Hmm.
describes it, it sounds amazing. And then I
Yeah.
started reading it and I was like, meh, I don't know. This isn't hitting home for me. And
Yeah.
but your book really helped me kind of give me permission to be like, that's totally okay. Just move,
Yeah.
you'll find something else.
It's okay.
Yeah.
I talk about in my book, W.H. Auden, who is one of the great poets of the 20th century. Um, Even he says, like, there's something frivolous about expecting to read a masterpiece of poetry every single day. Like
Mm,
he says, poetry doesn't have to be great to be good. It just depends on what mood you're in and what you need for that day. So allowing yourself to move pretty quickly through different things can help you just discover really amazing poems. I mean, I start the book by sort of asking people, what do you like? Do you like this kind of thing? Do you like that kind of thing? And I just throw a bunch of different kind of poems in
mhm,
front of people. And one of the things I do is put a really difficult poem by Hopkins up there, which is all rhyme and meter, but also really just very difficult to parse. Like, what is he actually saying? And there are some people who are like, come on, what is he actually saying? This totally doesn't work for me. And then I give him a poem by William Carlos Williams, This Is Just to Say, which is super short, super simple, doesn't rhyme, says exactly what it says. You can't not know what it means or what it says. And then you always get the reaction from some people who are like, well, why is that poetry? There's nothing, this is too easy. And then you sort of get, you sort of like, do you not like poetry because it's too hard, or do you not like poetry because it's too easy? Is there something else about? But there's poems of every kind in between to find. So it's just a
mhm.
matter of moving through and kind of finding what you like.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like we tend to have this attitude as adults looking at poetry. It's like we come in with a very judgmental attitude. Like it's like
Hmm.
we are going to judge this from the second we start reading it and determine whether it is good or not. And yeah, just kind of lightening up a bit with it, it
Yeah.
can go a long way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk, use a lot of the rest of our time together to talk about the latter half of your book because I found that really helpful. So for listeners, the first part of your book is kind of how to read poetry, and the second part of your book is the why. Like why do we read poetry? And you just give four different categories that I thought were so simple and so helpful for really getting at why does a poem resonate with me? And the four categories on naming creation, on telling the truth, on rejoicing with those who rejoice, and on weeping with those who weep. And in particular for Christians, for people in the church today, those four categories, you can't help read those without thinking of the biblical story and what's going on in Scripture, that these are some of our tasks as Christians. And so I wonder if we can just start with that first topic there on naming creation. What is it about poetry and naming? Why did you put those two together? And what does poetry do with naming that we can't do with science or journalism or even maybe theology?
Yeah. Well, I pull that from, and other poets have made the same connection. Auden is one of them, and others who talk about the very first task that Adam is given is to name creation. We think of Adam as, well, sometimes people think, well, what task did he have? And he was a gardener. Well, sure. But before that, the very first task he's given is to name creation in Genesis 2:19. And what I love about that passage is that the way, at least that it's presented, is that God doesn't know what he's going to say. So it's almost as though God is eager to find out what is Adam going to name creation. So there's this real partnership in creation going on. Sure, these things exist, but you name it, and the naming of it is part of what brings it into being as a knowable, relatable thing. So I think one of the differences when I think about poetry as naming, part of it is the act of discovery. The name discovers something that is real and discovers the nature of something. But it also brings it into relation. I have a relationship with the things that I can name. And it's that relational aspect that I think is at the heart of how we understand knowledge at a different level. To know something is to be in relationship to it. So in Hebrew, naming and knowing are very closely related to one another. To name something is to know what it is, which is why, when Moses says, tell me your name to God, God says, I am who I am. Like I name myself. Thank you very much. Like you can't actually fully know me. I don't have a name that you can have, but you can call me I am who I am. And that aspect of naming as a relational form of knowing, I think, is really essential to what poetry is about.
Yeah, I love that. It reminds me a bit. Recently, I was teaching our students of the church, and we've been working through the Ten Commandments lately. And we were on the third commandment of not taking the Lord's name in vain. And we were talking about what that means. Like on the one hand, many of us grew up maybe in Christian homes where they're like, that means don't say, oh my God. Like you can't say that, like
Hmm.
that's breaking the commandment. And we talked about that. Maybe it's not less than that, but certainly it's more than that. That there's a connection
Hmm.
between who God is and what his name is. And
Yeah.
that when you're representing a name, you're representing how you feel towards that being,
Hmm.
what you think about that being. And when you treat that name in vain, when you disrespect that name, then you're disrespecting the relationship. You're abusing the relationship even. And we just had this really lovely discussion about names. And I think kind of what you're getting after is connected to that
Hmm.
in the biblical story, names and relationship go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, I mean, kind of threaded through each of those four chapters at the end is the basic notion that what makes poetry different from lots of other art forms, and certainly from science and scientific description and that kind of thing, is that the relational element means that it aims at experience. The point of the poem is not just to name, but to produce a kind of experience in the naming. And that experience is part of what it means to know something. And so, what poetry is constantly trying to do is to get you to experience full body something and not just mentally assent to it or know it or cognitively say, aha, now I've got it.
Hmm.
I think of that in relation to the Psalms. Why do we have 150 Psalms and why do we repeat them so often? I mean, if all we are trying to do is get what the gist of them is in order to understand this aspect of God or that aspect of God notionally, then once you've got it, why read it again? But
Hmm.
a lot of us practice the reading of the Psalms repeatedly. The monks do this every week. They chant through all 150. Why? Well, because it's the re-saying of the poem that reproduces the experience that then reignites the relationship that only that poem could produce. So
Mhm.
it's the saying and doing of the poem that is part of the knowing and the naming.
Does that explain like the need for poetry to be read aloud as well? Is there a
Yeah.
connection between the experience of it and actually reading it out loud?
I mean, I definitely think that poems read aloud enhance the experience of what they're about. Now, not every poem is written to be read aloud. I mean, so a lot of poetic experimentation in the 20th century was about visual representations. So part of it was what kind of visual experience can you get from the poem by looking at it this way on the page, that then the words will help you into. So some poems are written to be visual. But I think a lot of poems are written to be oral and to be heard. And it's the hearing of that rhythm that allows you into the sort of fuller experience of the poem. It's also why, if you study a poem and get to know it really well, the point is still to go back and read it. I mean, like when you study a poem and know it really well, it doesn't mean that now you can just set the poem down and be done with it. The point is that the more I know a poem, the more I want to read it again, to have all of those layers experienced in the reading of the poem.
Yeah, there's like a contemplative aspect of poetry
Yeah,
in the reader's perspective. Like you're diving deeper and deeper into it. Very
yeah,
much like a religious exercise of some kind.
right.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, this is why I think poetry and scripture, they're not the same. I'm not trying to equate them, but why I think a lot of the experiences we have with scripture actually enable us to think about poetry differently.
Mm.
Because it's not as though if you grow up on the Bible, reading the Bible daily or whatever, it's not as though once you've read through Romans once, you're done with it, right?
Hmm.
You go back and read it again. It's not as though once you've heard that gospel story, you're done with it. You don't need to read the gospel story again. No, the point is part of the relationship with God is built into that practice, into that moment when you're actually reading those words.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, we preached, my wife preached last week on the story of Jesus in the wilderness and the temptations. We preach that every year during Lent.
Yeah.
And it gets difficult for the pastor because they have to come up with a new sermon
Yeah.
on it every time. But it's like the rehearsing the experience that draws you in. And that very much is, I mean, and you can think of all dates in the church year that help with that. Um,
Yeah.
the church is a community that is rehearsing something and
Yeah.
experiencing it over and over again. And yeah, that's right for poetry.
Well, and what you say also gives people some insight into why poetry changes and transforms and becomes things that sometimes they don't like. But when you
Mm,
say like a pastor, it's hard on the pastor to preach on the same passage every year and figure out a new way to innovate on it and make people see it fresh, see it new, experience it all over again in a new way. Well, the poets face the same basic problem. Like
mm.
when we say my love is like a red, red rose, well, when that was first said, that was pretty innovative. That was pretty interesting. And now, if you say my love is like a rose, people are like, that doesn't do anything for me. So now you got to find a different way to bring that experience into being in a new set of words and metaphors, analogies, similes, and so forth.
Yeah, I love that. I so when you think about naming, if someone were to be like, well, I mean, yeah, we get it. Adam named creation, and we've come up with names throughout history for different aspects of creation, but like that's pretty much done now. Like, we're we I mean, ChatGPT can tell me all the names I need to know. What is it what is it about for not just reading poetry, but writing your own poetry and naming experiences of life? What is important about that? What does that do
Hmm.
for us?
Well, I think the practice of naming helps you to know what it is you're going through and what you're related to, what you're seeing, what you're feeling, what you're experiencing. I mean, so even apart from the fact that we continue to discover new species that need to be named, like on a
Mhm.
scientific level, there's more creation out there than we've yet to scratch the surface of. Even apart from that, when you think about your day and how to name the experiences of your day, it's not as though there's new, it's not as though like, oh, no one's ever named this before.
Hmm.
But your ability to come up with the name that makes it resonate or makes it known is a kind of practice that is incumbent on all of us still. And it's that art, and what poetry does is enable us to borrow that art. So we one way we think about it is that poetry gives you articulation of the names that you were struggling to come up with for your own life. And you see somebody else say it in such and such a way, and he's like, "That's it. I've never been able to put my finger on it, but that's it."
Hmm.
Right? And that's one of the great gifts of poetry is this sharing of names for us to be able to identify the creation in which we live, including our own selves as part of that creation.
Yeah, I love that. And we all need that every day. And so much of life, you talk to a therapist and they will constantly tell their patients, you know what you need to do? You've got all these problems in life. You need to sit down and write and write and write. You need to
Hmm.
journal this out. And they're not necessarily saying go and write poetry, but it's kind of the same thing of like you need to name what is happening in your
Hmm.
life. And it reminds me a bit of what C.S. Lewis said about the imagination is the meaning-making organ. Like it's a
Hmm.
way of making meaning out of life when life could be boring, life could be full of grief, whatever it may be that's going on. It helps make the meaning possible.
Well, and even if you think about that therapist or many others who are trying to get people to understand what they're going through or some experience in their life or something, very often what you'll see is that they will turn to poetic devices. They're not thinking that they're writing poetry, but they're saying, well, it's kind of like this, and they'll give a comparison, or they'll give a simile, or they'll give an analogy, or they'll say you are acting this way, and it'll be a metaphor, like a lion or something, right? Like and these poetic devices are just part of our basic fabric of understanding. So we're actually practicing poetry on a regular basis all the time without calling it poetry or recognizing it as poetry. It's just that poets do it more sort of self-consciously.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just part of the way we understand the world.
Yeah, we can't not understand the world without metaphor and analogy and
Yeah.
the world that we see around us, the invisible world, the world of faith. It's all we use metaphors constantly to try to
Yeah.
grapple
Yeah.
with what this is all about. Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of like metaphors and stuff, we use metaphors to try to get at truth, and you have a chapter on telling the truth. What what kind of truths require poetry? What do you mean by poetry and truth and their connection? What is it that poetry can convey that just, a propositional statement may struggle to?
Yeah. I mean, well, we could dive right into the heart of the mysteries of the faith, right? I mean, if you talk about what is the truth of the incarnation or the truth of the Trinity or any of these things, you could say, well, there's a propositional way to make sense of those things.
Hmm.
But the propositions themselves don't make a lot of sense, right? Like three in one, but they're all distinct. Like
Yeah.
God made man, but still God, but still man, fully human, fully divine. Like the propositions themselves struggle to make sense of propositions.
Hmm.
And that's where I think poetry can actually tell the truth, but tell it slant. I mean, tell it in such a way that you see how things seemingly incompatible can be compatible and how paradoxes resolve and how the dance, I mean, the Eastern Orthodox talk about the Trinity in terms of perichoresis and this
Hmm.
dance of the Trinity. And you think of dance and that's a metaphor, that's an image to help you
Hmm.
make sense of what the Trinity is doing. And that's what poets are doing all the time, not just with divine mysteries, but with sort of mundane daily mysteries, right? Like, why do I long for this thing? Why do I feel sad about this thing or love that thing? Or there's all kinds of truths in the world that I think science can name in its own way, and it's very important. And yet, when you get the basic scientific explanation of it, you're like, that doesn't actually touch the experience I just had.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. It's like, can you offer any like off the top of your head, can you think of any poems in particular that like get at this, expanding
Well,
the truth for us?
well, I think about, I mean, one of my favorite poems on joy. Joy is a very hard thing to get to know. It's C.S. Lewis has a famous essay, um, what's it called? Transpositions, but where he talks
Oh
about
yeah.
how from one sphere to another, you often have a kind of reduction. And one of his examples of this is like, I have a feeling in my gut. Technically, that feeling in my gut is associated with things like nausea, anxiety, but also like joy, anticipation. And it's all the same feeling. Now,
Hmm.
when I'm going through it, I know which of those things it is. So there is this higher level understanding. And yet, if you reduce it to mere physical symptoms, you won't actually be able to tell which of these things it is. Um, and I think about that with like, how do you scientifically describe joy? You could do it, and you could talk about various physical things going on in the body with joy, for
Hmm.
sure. Then you can also talk about it the way Young Lee does in From Blossoms, where he talks about the just like basic, simple joy of eating an incredible peach on an incredible summer day, and like just there's no worries in the world. It feels like death is nowhere to be found, and life is full. And how does he do it? He uses all of these images. He uses all of this rhythm, all this alliteration. He ends in just a kind of incantatory repetition. And when you read that poem, you think joy. But
Mm.
it's a very different way of knowing joy, the
Hmm.
truth of what joy is, than a kind of scientific description of it. In the book, I also talk about lightning, like if a child asks what lightning is, you can give them a scientific explanation about electrical discharges and so on and so forth, and they'll think, oh, okay. And that you can also tell them that, as many did for hundreds of years, well, it's sort of like God throwing a spear at the earth.
Hmm.
And that actually gets at the truth of lightning profoundly. You can also say, well, lightning is beautiful and terrible. And you could talk about the beauty of it and the terror of it. You could talk about all different ways, and they're all true, and you kind of need them all. And that's where poetry begins to get into like the truth of lightning is also the experience of lightning and not just the description of it.
Yeah, yeah. It your comments on joy remind me of there's a class, I think both at Stanford and at Yale on happiness that they
Yeah.
offer to undergrad students. And
Yeah.
and and it's like one of their most schools is like one of their most popular classes.
Yeah, we offer a
And
class like that here too. Yeah,
oh,
they're
you do?
taking off
Okay.
all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, but it strikes me kind of like of course, I've never taken the class. I have no idea really what it's about. But the popularity of it makes me think, oh yeah, people want to figure out happiness.
Hmm.
Like they want to have the plan. Like, oh, I can take a course on this and then I will be able to
Hmm.
figure it out. And you know, when you talk about joy as something that like can run through you as you're experiencing this poem, that's just such a different thing from like I'm offering a class on how to teach you about happiness. It's
Right.
just like a totally different thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know. It's just and it's even I think it's an incredibly modern thing that we have classes on happiness, but yeah, I don't know. It just reminded
Yeah.
me of that we do have this longing for these deep emotions.
Hmm.
Um, and we don't always we kind of take the scientific method and we try to use that for things
Hmm.
that aren't scientific, that we need actually the arts for to help us engage those emotions more.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you talk about throughout your book about, as you were talking earlier, about poetry and relationships. And, we were just talking about knowing and how it's an experience, not just about, knowledge of facts, but it's an experiencing of the thing. And so your last couple chapters are all about those relationships, weeping with those who weep and rejoicing with those who rejoice. Why did you decide to conclude the book with those two emphasis? Because I thought they were two very powerful chapters, getting at the communal nature of poetry, that it's not
Mm.
something that you should only do by yourself, but it's something that we can do together and it can actually
Mm.
connect us in deep ways. So
Hmm.
yeah, you mind talking a little bit about those?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I do think that poetry craves a crowd more than we realize. We tend to think of it as a solitary art, either the solitary poet or the solitary reader of poetry. But poetry is historically and still very much a crowd sport.
Mm.
um,
Hmm.
both in terms of enjoying it, like if you really want to enjoy a poem, read it with a friend and talk about it. And if you really want to get into poetry and figure out the layers of poetry and learn to love it even more, then find a friend who likes a poem that you don't like and talk about that poem together, and do vice versa. So, just in terms of even the experience of reading it, I think it's one way to get to know other people's perspectives, even in the poems themselves. But the poems themselves, the content of these poems, also, they are like little windows into the lives of others. I mean, they are each of them a sharing out of the gift of oneself, at the very least, oneself to another. And I think in that basic aspect, they're asking us to commune with others. They're kind of reaching out and asking us to do that communal activity. I tell this story in the book, but sermon I heard long, long ago that said, why do we read the Psalms every day, and how should we read the Psalms every day? And the pastor was basically saying, don't look for the psalm that sort of just matches or mirrors what you're experiencing that day. Actually, just start at Psalm 1 and read one different psalm every day. And it'd be great if you read a psalm that actually does not match at all what you're experiencing that day, because it's the moment to remember that it does match somebody's experience in the body of Christ that day. And that'll be a chance for you to stop and pray for that person.
Hmm.
Whether it's joy and praise, whether it's sorrow and lamentation, whatever it might be, somebody in the body of Christ is feeling exactly that way today, even if it's not you. And that is a helpful way to think about poetry in general. Somebody is feeling this way today, even if it isn't me. And it
Hmm.
gives me a window into their experience and an ability to share with them in that experience that many other art forms can't do as quite as powerfully, in part because poetry is aiming at reproducing or producing or in some ways sharing out the experience itself and not just an understanding of the experience.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. It's like both for the person who may be feeling depressed and like lost in their grief, they read the Psalms and they read these Psalms of joy and praise. And it can be a very dissident experience to read that because you're like, well, that doesn't apply to me whatsoever. But I like what you're saying. It's like this, the Psalms invite us out of ourselves, like
Hmm.
that there's more to life than just us. They speak to our experience, but they also speak to everyone else's. And then on the other side too, I think right now, war's breaking out around the world, and it's like for someone who lives in a safe community where there's no threat of war, I can read some of the Psalms and be like, this doesn't really connect. But when I start to imagine like what is someone else going on through, the
Hmm.
Psalms are this incredible teaching tool.
Well, and
Um,
I would even add, so of course I borrow those two chapter titles from Romans 12:15, where Paul tells us to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And I think there's some part of us that understands the weep with those who weep more easily than the rejoice with those who rejoice. That is to say,
mhm.
I think we're more ready to sorrow with those who sorrow, actually, even as hard as that is to cross that gap, than it is to rejoice with those who rejoice. Because if we're not feeling very rejoiceful, then to move into their joy is even harder than to move into somebody else's. It feels like we're being generous when we move into somebody else's sorrow, but to move into somebody else's joy feels like it's taking something away from us.
Yeah.
And I once had a pastor say to me, one of the hardest spiritual disciplines is to give God thanks for the gifts that he's given to others and not given to you. It's even harder spiritual discipline to give God thanks for the gifts he has given to you, but given to somebody else in a greater degree.
Mm, yeah. That's convicting. I mean, that goes like right against the heart of competition that's driven into us
Yeah.
people in America. It's like, um, you know, even your best friends can become competitors and people
Yeah.
that you're like when something's good going for them, it's hard not to think, oh,
Right.
why isn't that happening for me? Or, you know,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So rejoicing with those who rejoice might be the more difficult task for us.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting. I mean, joy is one of those, I mean, like you were saying earlier, it's it's something that when we don't have it, we can't stop longing for it. And then when we do
Hmm.
have it, it's like we don't realize we have it always, and we don't
Hmm.
always recognize it.
Hmm.
And it slips away from us. So yeah, this is so helpful. Just as we wrap up, I wanted to talk a little bit about the practice of learning to read poetry
Mm.
aloud, because I think it's such a gift when you hear a someone read a poem and they've actually gone to the work of
Yeah.
being able to read it really well. I mean,
Yeah.
if you ask anyone, I think what poet do they remember in the last like decade? They'd probably say Amanda Gorman at Biden's
Yeah.
inauguration, where it's like even the people who are like don't like poetry were like, wow, that
Yeah.
was amazing. And I think so much it was of course a good poem, but also like she had mastered the ability to share it with the world.
Yeah.
Um,
And those are not the same art form. That is the poem and the performance of the poem are two different art forms.
mm,
And I do think you can like poetry without being able to read it well out loud because
mhm.
not everybody's given that gift. Um, and so I wouldn't want to presume and say, well, you can only really get poetry and like poetry if you're also able to perform poetry. But that because that's just a whole nother art form.
Right, right. Yeah. But at the same time, do you feel like those are actually like if someone does have that gift, if someone has that ability, like what how would you do you have any advice for someone like that who's like
Yeah.
how do you share that? Like I think, you know, in churches we often have special music, you know, like songs that are sung and they're like
Hmm.
gifts to the congregation. But like,
Yeah.
I'm imagining like, what would it look like for people to share poetry in that way
Yeah.
in the
Well, I
context?
do think that great readers of poetry are really wonderful to listen to, and almost any kind of poem, you can begin to understand the nature of that poem differently when
Hmm.
it's well read. But we have the basic sense of this in churches, right? Like we have different readers of scripture, and we think to ourselves, well, that's a better reader of John
Yeah.
1 than that person. And so, I mean, we have a basic sense of better and worse readers out loud, and it's just its own art form. And I would say that I think all people, regardless of whether you can do this sort of thing well out loud or not, can gain from trying to read a poem out
Mm.
loud. I think that if you're embarrassed and you just want to do it on your own in your own room, that's fine too. But it's worthwhile trying to hear a poem that way and to do it out loud because it does change the nature of the poem. And if you're doing that, then a couple things I would suggest, which is simple things like the end of a line is not necessarily where you pause when you're saying something out loud. So, one of the things poets are doing with their lines is they're producing mental breaks, but not necessarily performative breaks.
Mm.
And part of understanding what a poem is doing is asking what's the juxtaposition between a line that moves forward onto the next line without pause, but still is a line break. So mentally you've got a break, but orally you don't. And if you know that, it produces these sorts of tensions and juxtapositions that are kind of interesting. So if you read a poem out loud, don't necessarily stop at the end of every line. Keep moving. Move for the grammar, for the commas and the periods, because poets are using those as breaks for a purpose. They're places to catch your breath, and poets are working with the beat of your breath through the punctuation itself in a poem.
I love that. Yeah, that was one of the first things I learned when someone was teaching me how to read poetry aloud. I
Yeah.
kept stopping at the breaks and
Yeah.
she just hammered me. She's like, you
Yeah.
gotta just use the periods. Just stop at the periods, not anywhere
Yeah.
else. Yeah, and so it does. It's a skill that is worthwhile investing in. Um,
Yeah.
well, Abram, thank you so much for this
Yeah.
conversation. What a
Absolutely.
joy it really was for me just to be able to talk to you, get to know you, and to learn from you about poetry. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me on here. It's a real pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Faith Informing Podcast. If this episode encouraged you, share it with a friend and consider leaving a review. Until next time, make space, stay curious, and keep being formed by the faith you confess.